There is a hair. I got it. Ha. Ha. You hair. Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Crue Trime. Crue Trime. Crue Trime. If you are new here, hello and welcome. My name is Sarah, and what I do here is tell you a terrible story to ruin your day and put on my makeup at the same time. So if that sounds like fun to you, you're in the right place. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel, turn on all of the notifications, and then that way you will never miss one of my terrible stories. Today's terrible story was recommended by somebody who would rather not be named. You know who you are. Thank you. And it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. So let's just get into it. This is the story of Whitney Gray and Brandon Griswold. By the way, I don't really talk about the makeup that I'm using as I'm using it, but if you want to know what it is, just look down in the description box because everything is linked. On September 26th, 2015, around 11:50 a.m., East Nashville, Tennessee detective Mike Rowland was dispatched to the Howe Garden Apartments at 1921 Greenwood Avenue. 2 days earlier, 24-year-old Preston Lee Claybrooks Jr. had been reported missing by his mother, Malench Marable. And I'm probably not saying her name properly, so I apologize. She had not seen or spoken to Preston in like almost a week. So Preston and his longtime girlfriend, 23-year-old Alexandra Grubbs, had been living across town in this apartment for about 3 months. In this apartment, they actually shared with another couple, some friends of theirs that Mrs. Marable didn't know. But from what she knew, this arrangement was meant to be mutually beneficial. You know what I mean? They're all young people, they're trying to get their shit together, save a little bit of money, you know what I'm saying. The Howe Garden Apartments housed mostly young people, just starting out, recent college grads, and young folks transitioning into adulthood. Preston and Alex were actually the parents of 2 small children, a boy named Elijah and a girl named Aliana. The kids were not living with them. They were actually with Mrs. Marable at the time, but she communicated with her son Preston every day. So after a few days of not being able to reach him or Alex, she went over to the apartment herself. When she knocked on the door, there was no answer, but there was a smell. You know exactly what smell. So Mrs. Marable called the police right then and there. She waited outside as Detective Rowland and other officers went inside the apartment. As they walked up the breezeway to the apartment, the stench was strong. After a very quick walk through the apartment, they found nobody home. They were able to determine that the apartment was leased to a 20-year-old man named Brandon Griswold. They also very quickly determined that something was very wrong. Let's back it up, shall we? So this apartment was leased, as I mentioned, to a 20-year-old guy named Brandon Griswold, with his father as a co-signer. Brandon Paul Griswold was born on July 9th, 1995 in Athens, Alabama. He graduated from Athens High School and was an aspiring musician and songwriter. If you look online, you can still find a couple of videos of him on YouTube. Okay, I'll show them to you. Okay, let me move over a little bit. So this video is from August of 2014, and it shows a 19-year-old Brandon being a terrible drummer. And there's another one where he is singing and playing guitar. Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. Very average. Whitney Noel Gray was born on October 7th, 1993 in Denton, Texas, but her family actually moved to Oklahoma when she was very young, and that's where she grew up. In her own words, she had a fabulous childhood. Well, isn't that nice? So nice. So Whitney was a pretty good student, and she sang in an all-girls choir. She had a fun, spunky personality, according to high school friends. And remember, I said that this story was recommended by somebody who didn't want to be named. Well, that person actually went to high school with Miss Whitney. So I checked, and the school was quite large, right? So I'm not going to say anything that's going to reveal who this person was. I will leave out one more specific memory, but she did say that Whitney was vegetarian, emo, and good at makeup. So after graduating from high school in Tulsa, Oklahoma, she went to beauty school, becoming a licensed cosmetologist in 2013. A year after that, she decided to join her bestie who had moved to Nashville, Tennessee. The two of them were very ambitious and wanted to go into business together. some kind of beauty thing. So Whitney's parents packed her up and drove her to Nashville, of course, never imagining that things were going to end up the way they did. All right, so it's 2014. Whitney is now in Nashville. She's gotten herself a job at a Great Clips in Gallatin, Tennessee, which is about a half hour outside of the city. Things were going pretty good. And then she met a guy named Brandon. Okay, so it's not really clear to me how Brandon ended up in Nashville because he lived in Athens, Alabama. That's where he was from. And Athens, Alabama is like 100 miles south of Nashville, so it's not like he was near, commutable distance. But he did have an apartment there. So was he chasing his musical dreams in Nashville? Maybe. Let's just say he was. Anyway, right from the beginning, Brandon and Whitney's relationship was not good. Okay, it was very toxic. Brandon was into hard drugs, and it didn't take long before Whitney got herself wrapped up in that shit too. In a few short months, it had escalated to a point where she was a regular, needle drug user. So Whitney moved out of the apartment with her friend and in with Brandon in his apartment in East Nashville. Brandon and Whitney were hard partiers. Dude, nonstop. Partying, drugs. It was a bad scene. But to her credit, Whitney was still working regularly. I wasn't able to find any indication that Brandon worked at all. But remember, Whitney had that job and they needed the money for drugs. And this is how they came to know Preston Claybrooks and his high school sweetheart, Alexandra Grubbs. Preston just so happened to be a drug dealer, and he was their regular supplier for things like meth, heroin, crack, and other delights. In fact, all four of them were heavy partiers, heavy drug users going nowhere fast. And in the summer of 2015, Preston and Alex moved in to the apartment's second bedroom. Remember, they were young parents trying to get their shit together, allegedly. Brandon would often get heroin from Preston and then agree to pay him later. And by the fall, he had racked up a pretty substantial debt, like $650 worth of debt. And owing money to roommates that happened to be, drug dealers, not an ideal situation. What? What, Murray? Not an ideal situation. So things in the apartment were getting tense. I am not an expert in such things, but to my understanding, when you are in the drug trade, when you are a dealer, most of the time you're part of a larger organization. Somebody else sources the things, produces the stuff. They find people to sell it for them. Everyone makes money. It's very MLM vibes.
Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss.
You know what I'm saying? Anyway, but when supplies are going out and the payments aren't coming back to, the supplier, the boss, it becomes a very dangerous situation for that dealer and for those customers.
Playing with my money is like playing with my emotions.
So bottom line, having debts in the drug world, not good. Is anybody keeping a counter of how many times I say it wasn't good? All that to say, it's not really clear to me whether or not Preston and Alex were actually paying rent to Brandon to live in the apartment. And I'm thinking no, and I'll tell you why. If Brandon had a debt with Preston, he could have just told him to not bother paying rent and then they would just call it even. But I wonder if Brandon had racked up more drug debt than what Preston's share of the rent or whatever money Whitney was able to bring in was. Also, he and Whitney weren't exactly in their right mind, making good decisions. They were all strung out on hard drugs. So now fast forward to late September of 2015, Brandon owes Preston $650. Neither he or Whitney have the money, so it might as well be $1 million. Like, how are they going to get out of this debt? These shitheads in their drugged out haze decided that they needed to eliminate Preston and Alex. So they brainstormed ideas. They did a proper pros and cons list of how to do it, what to do with the bodies, whether to bury them or dump them in water. Critical thinking going on. And yet, no non-lethal ideas discussed. So on the morning of September 21st, 2015, Preston and Alex were asleep in their bedroom, door closed and locked. Brandon and Whitney decided it was time to make moves. So using some kind of card, they jimmied the door open. Preston and Alex were knocked out cold, so they didn't wake up for anything. So Whitney and Brandon entered the room armed. She had a hammer and he had a microphone stand. They each got into position, Whitney on the left standing over Alex and Brandon on the other side standing over Preston. Brandon gave the signal, like a head nod. Probably wasn't like that. And then they commenced their attack. Using the hammer and the microphone stand, they beat their heads in. Each of them suffered at least a dozen blows to the head, blunt force trauma that broke their skulls. There were no defensive wounds. Afterward, Brandon and Whitney went back into their bedroom to collect their thoughts. Whitney would later say that she was very paranoid and she thought for sure that she could hear them breathing in the other room. So Brandon went back and using a knife cut each of their throats, although he later claimed that they did it together. Either way, what they had on their hands was a very gruesome crime scene. Blood everywhere. So these two druggy shitheads got good and high first, and then they wrapped up their dead friends in blankets from the beds, mummy style. They dragged them to a utility closet, the kind with like the hot water heater in it, stuff like that, electrical panel. Alex's body went in first, and then Preston, and then they put in a bunch of black sheets, more blankets, big boxes, random rubbish piled all the way to the ceiling. The bloody hammer ended up in the trash can, and the microphone stand was tossed in the trunk of Whitney's car. The bloody mattress was then dragged into Brandon's bedroom. Apparently he didn't have a mattress. He was just like sleeping on some kind of foam egg crate topper. They covered the mattress with towels and then put his foam egg crate topper on top, and then the sheets and all of that. And they slept on it for the next couple of days. What? Why was that a good idea? Drugs. Don't do drugs. They made themselves a little cleaning to-do list that was later found. It mentioned making sure to use bleach. And they did. They used bleach and rags to try to clean up the mess, and they did a terrible job. There was still blood spatter like on the walls and ceiling that they just missed. And then they just went about their business like everything was normal. 2 hours later, Whitney went to Great Clips for her shift. She continued actually going to work that entire week like nothing happened.
No, don't like that.
Brandon ended up buying a cheap mattress that he found on Craigslist. In their mind, they needed to make sure that there was a mattress in that second bedroom so that it didn't look weird. The druggy idiots never got rid of the bloody mattress. The math ain't mathin'. So anyway, now we are back to the beginning of the story. Preston's mother hadn't heard from her son, which was very strange. She was alarmed and she came over to the apartment herself and she smelled death. I mean, it's no wonder. There were 2 dead bodies inside the apartment that had been rotting for nearly a week at that point. Come to find out, other neighbors had also complained about the smell in the air, thinking maybe somebody had a bunch of trash or maybe there was a dead pet in one of the apartments or something. So when the police arrived at the apartment to check it out, nobody was home. But it was very clear that a crime had occurred. First of all, the stench was overwhelming. They also noticed this bad blood cleanup job. Once they had a search warrant in place, they were able to get inside and really dig in and look around. So over the next 8 hours, the police found everything they needed to put the crime together, including the bodies, the weapons, the forensic evidence, and everything told the story of what happened. When they found the bodies in the closet, their faces were unrecognizable. They actually had to identify them using their tattoos. When their autopsies were later completed, they found large quantities of crack cocaine, meth, heroin, and alcohol between the 2 of them. Police also found some drug paraphernalia like pipes and things, but no other real evidence of drug dealing like scales and product, nothing like that, which is interesting. So then they issued an alert for Brandon, the leaseholder of the apartment. He wasn't obviously a suspect at first, but they wondered that maybe something had happened to him as well. They obviously had no idea why something like this had occurred. Meanwhile, somehow, Whitney had heard about the police essentially raiding their apartment, and she was able to get a hold of Brandon. They met at a nearby drugstore, and then they spent the night together out in the woods. There's some conflicting reporting about this. Either they moved out of the apartment into like a nearby homeless encampment, or she found out and they just were hiding. Either way, they weren't there. As the investigation progressed, the police started actively looking for Whitney and Brandon. The media also started reporting on the event pretty heavily. They publicized the fact that Brandon and Whitney were on the run, essentially, and that the police were seeking them for questioning, but not necessarily that they were suspects. Well, the police started looking around town in the areas where, like, the unhoused people would routinely gather. There was an area near a rail yard called Crue Hall that was kind of a hotspot. A man told police that he had recognized Brandon there recently. So as a group of police officers pulled into this gas station parking lot, the attendant working inside told them that Brandon and Whitney were across the street at a restaurant.
One of the cops just, saw me and my brother point him out, and he just stopped him.
They were very quickly detained and then taken down to the police station for questioning.
But before they were found there, police tell us that they were hanging out right here at the Radnor Rail Yard at Creve Hall.
Officers were going to marshal up here in this parking lot to form a search party to begin looking around the tracks and the areas just off the tracks to see if we could find any sign of them. And as they pulled into the parking lot, Gray and Griswold were actually standing outside Mamma Mia's restaurant.
Okay, so surprisingly, these two confessed, like, pretty much immediately. Whitney rolled over first, but Brandon wasn't far behind at all. Their stories matched pretty well, except for the part about who cut their throats, Preston and Alex. Brandon told the police that he thought that Preston was trying to take over his apartment and that he had a gun, so it was him or them. Okay. So Whitney and Brandon were each charged ×2 with capital murder, theft over $500, tampering with evidence, and tampering with a corpse. And the state was seeking life without parole. So after some initial legal gymnastics, at first they were both pleading not guilty. Maybe they were trying to pin it on each other. I don't know how that works when you both confess, but okay. Anyways, 2 years later, Brandon and Whitney both decided to enter a plea agreement. In the penalty phase at the sentencing hearing, they each received life in prison with parole after 50 years. Whitney will become eligible in the year 2067. The Tennessee Department of Corrections currently lists Brandon as deceased, and a photo for him has not been updated since 2019. No other information is available. And that is the story of Whitney Gray and Brandon Griswold. Thanks again to the awesome viewer who recommended this terrible story. You know who you are. Thank you. If you have a Crue Trime story that you want to recommend to me, look down in the description box for the link to the Google Doc where you can complete all of the details. I would very much love to hear from you. If you want to know any of the makeup that I used in today's look, just look down in the description box. Everything is linked, and if it's not available anymore because it's old or expired or discontinued, I will find you something similar. Thank you so much for hanging out today and for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then consider subscribing to this channel before you leave today. I upload new videos here on YouTube every week, and you can follow me on all of the other socials as well. That is it for now. I will catch you next time in the next video. Bye! Escalated to fucking goddamn it. Get it together. Yes? Do you need to tell me something? Why can't I say railroad? Railroad. I'm a mess. There's hairs all over my face. Everything looks terrible. Get it together. There is a hair. I got it. Ha! Fuck you, hair. I cannot get my life together. Oh my god. Stin Lee Claybook. Okay, let me get myself together. Pete! Pete! Pete is licking the straw to my cup. Peter!